Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Early Days by Miss Reed, the section A Fortunate Grandchild. Grandma Reed. She was my mother's mother and must have been nearly 70 when I first became conscious of her in about 1915. At that time, my father was serving in France with H Battery of the Royal Horse Artillery, and my mother was carrying on his job as an insurance agent. My elder sister and I were left with Grandma Reed, who lived nearby, for most of the day. She was small and neat, with a very smooth skin and dark hair parted in the middle and taken back behind her ears into a bun. Her hair remained dark and glossy until her death at 76. It was generally believed that she had a Portuguese forebear, and her looks would certainly bear this out. She dressed well. Her frocks were of dark silk, usually brown or black, trimmed with lace and made with a high neck. She was particularly fond of prettily trimmed bonnets worn tied under the chin with ribbons. As children, we often gave her bonnet trimmings of feathers or velvet for her birthday or Christmas presents. One particular bonnet I remember clearly, trimmed with velvet pansies of different colors, which framed her face and delighted my admiring eye. An older cousin of mine remembers her as a very happy lady. She had a nice smile, and her eyes smiled too. That is how I remember her also. She was a wonderful companion to young children, cheerful, sprightly, and not over-anxious, as so many adults are, about the niceties of correct behavior or the awful consequences of such daring feats as jumping off low walls or down the conservatory steps. Having had 12 children of her own, she was probably past worrying over much. She indulged me in small ways, and I loved her for it. During that war, food supplies were extremely short, especially in London. My mother had instilled in us that we were never to ask for sweets or anything with sugar in it because people had so little. My grandmother, however, would frequently spread butter, or more probably margarine in those days, on half a slice of bread and then scatter brown sugar on it. I watched greedily as she cut it into fingers, which I soon demolished. I knew, as well as she did, that this activity was only undertaken when we were alone, and I had enough sense, even at 3, to keep it our secret. Twice a week, Grandma left her house to walk a few hundred yards to the small cinema. She adored films, black and white and silent, of course, and rarely missed one. They were changed twice a week, and Grandma returned from her outings much refreshed. Sometimes she was accompanied by one of my aunts or a cousin, but she was perfectly happy to go alone. Charlie Chaplin, Pearl White, Mary Pickford, and all the rest provided her with exciting enough company. St. Swithin's Church, a little further along the road, was the family's parish church. I cannot remember if my grandfather was a regular member of the congregation, but my 2 aunts, Rose and Jess, certainly were, and clergymen, choir boys, and other church members often came back after service to 267 Hither Green Lane for refreshments, and to sing round the piano in Grandma's drawing room. My sister, 3 years older than I am, was as bored as I was on these occasions, and it was she who showed me how delightful it was to creep behind the piano and sit there among piles of sheet music in comparative peace. Of the 12 children born to my grandmother, 8 survived, which was not a bad percentage in those days. The date of her marriage I do not know, but probably around the mid-60s of the 19th century. She told her children that her wedding dress was much admired, and that she wore an aerophane bonnet with gooseberries on it. What aerophane was nobody knew, but the unintentional couplet is unforgettable. Queen Victoria was on the throne from the time of Grandma's birth until she was in her 50s. It was not a very healthy time for babies or their mothers, and I suppose that to have 8 out of 12 living to maturity was not bad going. The first child, my Uncle George, I never knew. He had emigrated to Australia, married there, and had children, one of whom was called Harleen. As this was also the name of a hair tonic at that time, the family found it an odd choice. I don't think Grandma heard from him very often. My aunts Liz and Nell were married with children, and my mother, the last but one of this long family, had produced my sister Lil and me. Another sister, Betty, was born much later in 1927. Of the remaining boys, my Uncle Chris was married, but he and my Aunt Maud were childless. The 3 unmarried children, my Aunt Jess, Aunt Rose, and Uncle Harry, lived at home with my grandmother, so that the house was always busy and there always seemed to be someone free to take an interest in one's pleasures. I knew all the Beatrix Potter stories before I started school, thanks to one or the other of the aunts who always seemed able to spare time to read them to us. They also sang to us, as did my mother. It was a great family for singing. As well as the more obvious nursery rhymes, such as Ring-a-Ring-a-Roses, we rejoiced in such roistering music hall numbers as Joshua, Joshua, nicer than lemon squash you are. You'll be pleased to know you are my best beau. Naturally, I thought this had some obscure connection with my hair ribbon. Or, rendered at terrific pace, any old iron, any old iron, any old iron, you look sweet, just a treat, you look a daisy from your napper to your feet. We sang too, unconscious of their poignancy, the contemporary wartime songs such as Goodbye, goodbye, wipe the tear, baby dear, from your eye. It's hard to part, I know, but I'll be tickled to death to go. In the great cupboard under the kitchen dresser, Grandma had 2 wooden grooved butter pats, and these she would give me with a large lump of plasticine. Bashing happily, I tried to emulate the deft strokes of the grocer at the local home and colonial stores, who slapped up pounds of butter and margarine on a marble slab, ending with beautiful striped oblongs. Mine were less symmetrical, and the din must have been prodigious, but I cannot remember anyone objecting in that indulgent household. Another object which I admired in the kitchen was a pincushion in the shape of a Chinese doll. It had a round head with a pigtail, and its stuffed body was made of dark red satin. It was occasionally lifted down from its peg by the mantelpiece for me to hold, but I was not allowed to play with it in case of the pins and needles with which it bristled. No doubt the aunts and Grandma also envisioned me swallowing some. In any case, after a brief period of admiration, it was returned to safety. Never did I feel that I was a nuisance, as I must have been quite often, and looking back, I realized it was Aunt Jess who bore the brunt of my relentless attentions. She deserves a few pages to herself. Aunt Jess. My Aunt Jess, the youngest of the brood, was virtually housekeeper and general dog's body. I loved her dearly. She was small in stature, rather skinny, and had dark hair which she frizzed with hair tongs heated in the fishtail flame of the gas bracket in the bedroom. I watched this operation with great interest. The smell of singed hair was alarming. Would my Aunt Jess go up in smoke? Nevertheless, I much admired the semi-afro fringe which resulted. When she took off her gold pince-nez, her eyes looked weak, as though they belonged to someone else. The look frightened me as much as the dreadful concentrated look of my mother as she threaded a needle. Perhaps it was the complete withdrawal into another realm that shook me. I only know that I was relieved when Aunt Jess replaced her glasses, which made a cruel red indentation on each side of her slightly snubbed nose, and my mother succeeded in threading the needle, and both returned to me. Aunt Jess had been trained as a dressmaker, and at the top of the house was her small workroom. Here there were the most fascinating objects. A large model figure encased in shiny sateen dominated the room. From the hips down was a wire cage, but above that the great swelling bust billowed out regally from the wasp waist. The whole thing was topped with a shiny wooden knob where the neck should be. Aunt Jess referred to this inanimate companion as Arabella, and always seemed to be hovering around her with her mouth full of pins as she draped material over that exuberant bust. Aunt Jess also had the miniature clothes which she had made when she had learnt her craft. These miracles of feather stitching, tucking, hemming, smocking, and so on were mounted on cardboard, and we were not allowed to touch them. There was a long workbench covered in black oil cloth, much scratched by scissors, pins, and other tools of the trade. I remember adding to the scars by trundling an object with a little wheel up and down the surface. It left a fascinating row of pinpricks, but a slap on the hand put an end to this pleasant pastime. Of course, there were drifts of tissue paper patterns and transfers in blueprint on filmy paper depicting unlikely flowers, garlands, and geometrical edgings. There was also a delicious substance called, I believe, tailor's chalk, which was flat and shiny and used for marking material. Sometimes Aunt Jess would give me a broken piece. If licked, it clung to one's lips rather disconcertingly. It drew beautifully, though, on pieces of brown paper spread flat on the kitchen floor, ready for my artistic efforts later in the day. In this minute room, Aunt Jess fitted her clients' clothes. I don't know if she had many customers, but she certainly had very little time for this particular pursuit. She did most of the cooking, house cleaning, and laundry work, for I cannot remember any help in the house, and it was a fairly large one to keep clean. She also made a good many clothes for the family, and I can remember several of the things she made for us as children. My sister and I were resplendent in black and white check coats with black velvet collars at one stage. I had a white muff on a cord round my neck with this rig out. Whether Lil also sported one I cannot recall, but if she objected, I have no doubt she was spared. She was a strong-minded child. Aunt Jess also concocted green velvet frocks for us, with curious tabs round the waist, somewhat reminiscent of medieval tunic decorations, a late flowering of the pre-Raphaelite influence, perhaps? Each tab was decorated with an embossed pink rose, and I can't think that a row of these round that portion of our anatomy, hopefully known as our waists, could have done anything for us. She also made us cream delaine pinafore frocks. I wore a pink-sprigged blouse with mine and Lil a blue. Much later, she made me a white voile frock for my confirmation. It had a lace insertion down the front and lace endings at neck and cuffs. I loathed it, and no doubt poor Aunt Jess was not thanked properly for it. I was much nicer at 3 than at 13. I can remember a splendid evening cloak she made for my mother from some forgotten function when the war was over. It was of bronze satin, lined with peach satin, and had large buttons covered with the same brown material. My Aunt Rose, who deserves and will get a few pages to herself, had painted each button with a little sprig of pink flowers, and the whole effect was stunning. All this work on delicate or heavy material was done on Aunt Jess's Frister Rossmann sewing machine. This was a fine German instrument, and could either be worked by turning a handle or by a foot treadle. I wonder now how Aunt Jess could have done such fine work, for her hands were always rough and chapped from housework. The cleaning materials of some 60-odd years ago were pretty fierce. Soda, Monkey brand, strong yellow soap cut in thick chunks from a long, heavy bar of the stuff, using the kitchen shovel to get plenty of purchase on it. Hearthstone for the doorsteps and Brasso for the knockers, finger plates and doorknobs, all took their toll on human skin, and a little Pond's cold cream was probably all that Aunt Jess's hard-working hands ever received. No doubt she was too whacked at night to even bother with that. Looking back, I wonder that Aunt Jess never married. It is true that she was no beauty, but many plainer women have found husbands. She had a sweet disposition and was unfailingly kind. When some years later my mother was seriously ill, it was Aunt Jess who came to hold the fort. When my younger sister was born, it was again Aunt Jess who ran the house. She never seemed to sit down and have a real rest. I used to dog her footsteps up the interminable flights of stairs or down into the terrifying cellar which ran beneath the hall and out under the front garden. Near the cellar door was a small cupboard where newspapers were stored for lighting fires, together with bundles of kindling wood. One day, close at Aunt Jess's heels, I watched her pulling out paper and wood, hurrying as usual, puffing slightly as she rushed from one job to the next, when she dropped her armful with a dreadful squeal, yelping, "A mouse! A mouse!" Shuddering, she fled to the kitchen. I looked into the murk of the paper cupboard, but the mouse had vanished. Disappointed, I returned to Aunt Jess. Now, I am ashamed to say I react with as much horror to an intruding mouse as dear Aunt Jess. Although she was always busy, she found time to read, as I said, such delectable works as The Tale of Mrs. Tittlemouse and The Tale of Benjamin Bunny to us. And I can remember a favorite game of mine which she played with me whilst she was ironing or stirring a pot on the kitchen range. The game was simple and was called Shopping. Armed with a basket, I asked my busy aunt for such things as Sunlight soap, cocoa, a loaf of bread, and other such basic necessities which were still procurable in wartime. With a wave of her one free hand, she would deposit the invisible goods in my basket, and I would pay her with bone counters. The delicious climax came when I requested a farthing's worth of currants. At this, my indulgent aunt would cease her task for a minute and reach up to the high kitchen shelf where stood a row of metal canisters. From one, she shook into my fat palm a few precious currants. I handed over my counter farthing, and the game ended in blissful nibbling. I realize now how much Aunt Jess meant to that household at 267 Hither Green Lane. She was Grandma Reed's right hand, for her other two unmarried inhabitants, Aunt Rose and Uncle Harry, were out at work, and an amazingly good aunt to the many children of the family who came to stay. She was also my godmother as well as my aunt, and I am glad that my parents gave me my second name, Jessie, as a tribute to her. Aunt Rose. My Aunt Rose must have been 10 or more years older than Aunt Jess and was quite a different kettle of fish. Grandma Reed seemed to defer rather more to Aunt Rose's judgment than to Aunt Jess's. Aunt Rose was small and dark, but plumper and decidedly more handsome than Aunt Jess. She had masses of glossy dark brown hair, always beautifully dressed, a fine complexion which she tended with papier-poudré leaflets torn from a tiny booklet kept in her handbag, and very bright dark eyes like her mother's. She dressed well and wore a good many brooches and beads. She taught at Ennersdale Road School nearby, and I have no doubt, knowing now some of the qualities needed to make a sound infants teacher, that Aunt Rose was an exceptionally competent one. Her manner was motherly, but brisk and firm. Her standards of behavior were high, and she would have brooked no laziness. She was blessed, too, with those accomplishments most needed for infant work. She was artistic and very skilled with her hands. Grandma's drawing room had several of her watercolors on the walls, and she worked indefatigably with such ploys as pen painting, crochet, and something called, I believe, pastinala work. This latter involved painting such objects as kingfishers perched on bulrushes or sprays of flowers onto black velvet or satin, and then spraying them with minute glass balls. The result was a shiny picture, and many cushion covers, table runners, and evening bags were pressed upon reluctant recipients. My sister and I, as we grew older, deplored Aunt Rose's taste and her industry, and were particularly difficult about some velvet hairbands ornamented with roses, which my mother insisted on our wearing at least once to please her older sister. She must have found great consolation in such projects as classroom friezes, pasting pictures on screens, book jackets, and making calendars, Christmas and Easter cards, paper windmills, artificial flowers, and all the other endless forms of handwork undertaken in the infants class. There must be many of her pupils who remember Aunt Rose with affection and owe their basic grounding in handwork, reading, writing, and arithmetic to her sound teaching. She was a determined woman. Later, I heard just how tenaciously she had persisted in taking up her teaching career. Evidently, she had served several years as a pupil teacher before deciding that she must qualify as a certificated teacher. For this, she needed to take a teacher's training course. In those days, this needed money, which Aunt Rose did not have. Grandma Reed, although approving of Rose's ambitions, simply had no idea how to set about helping her. With commendable courage, Aunt Rose went to an uncle of hers who was rather better off than the rest of the family and put the problem to him. He nobly stumped up. Aunt Rose promised to repay him as soon as she had a teaching job, and before long she was a student at Brighton Training College, where I have no doubt she did extremely well. It was Aunt Rose who took me first to school with her. This must have been in 1917, on April 17th, as I know that my 4th birthday was the next day. My clever elder sister was already steaming ahead on the 2nd floor of the great LLC building in the big girls department. I was deposited in the babies class, not Aunt Rose's, and given a box of china beads to thread, whilst admiring the magnificent rocking horse and making plans for an early ride. My hopes were dashed by the afternoon when it was discovered that I could read. I was wrenched from my beads and the rocking horse and pushed up one standard where I had to work quite hard. Aunt Rose was delighted. I was not. Although Grandma Reed was undoubtedly the head of her household, and she was deferred to by all those in it, I have no doubt that Aunt Rose played a large part in its running. She had plenty of business sense and would have been capable of coping with household accounts and such matters as insurance, leases, rates, and other domestic and financial affairs. I suspect, too, that her salary was a major part of the family's income, and she would see it was wisely spent. Not that she was mean. Although she dressed well and always appeared with good shoes, handbags, and hats, she was generous with her presents to nieces and nephews and gave us all some splendid books, interspersed, of course, with the regrettable hairbands, belts, and collars of her own making. And I still use Tales from Shakespeare by Charles and Mary Lamb, published by Ward Lock and ablaze with beautiful colored plates, and inscribed in Aunt Rose's hand, "To dear little Dora, with love." It was a present for my 9th birthday. As well as spending her money on books for us, both she and Aunt Jess were generous in taking us to the theater as soon as we were old enough to enjoy it. We saw all the Aldwych farces with Tom Walls and Ralph Lynn and Mary Brow of blessed memory, as well as No No Nanette and other light musicals which appealed to my aunts. We were also taken to a lavishly produced version of A Midsummer Night's Dream, complete with a slowly breaking dawn, gauzy fairies, Mendelssohn's music, and the most ravishing costumes and sets. This was in the early 1920s and may have been the Max Reinhardt production. It certainly impressed us. Looking back, I can see that Aunt Rose's dominance in the household must have been irksome at times to her youngest sister, Aunt Jess. Grandma Reed, I imagine, was able to ignore or even be mildly amused by Rose's bossiness. Aunt Jess would have had to endure it rather more directly, and some years later, after Grandma Reed's death, she and Uncle Harry, together with an older sister Lizzie, set up house together while Rose bought a comfortable house not far from Hither Green Lane, which she converted into 2 very pleasant flats, one for her own use and the other to let to well-vetted tenants. Aunt Rose was certainly the best-looking, best-dressed, and probably the most intelligent of Grandma's daughters. She never married, although she had a steady admirer, and they remained devoted for many years. Her manner with men was somewhat flirtatious and affected, and my father, who was a cheerfully irreverent man, took great delight in teasing her. As we grew older, my sister and I were embarrassed by her affected ways and naughtily amused by the dark hints she gave about what might have been. I well remember walking home with her after seeing The Student Prince and remarking that it was a pity that he married the wrong girl in the end. The hero's sense of duty, I was about 10 at the time, seemed misplaced to me. "Ah," said Aunt Rose, sighing heavily into the darkness, "life is like that. One has to put one's duty to others before one's own pleasures." And then followed several remarks which might have been construed as Aunt Rose's personal renunciation of passionate love and blissful marriage in order to maintain the household at 267. But There again, it may just have been the aftermath of seeing the student prince late one night at the Lewisham Hippodrome. We'll find out more about Aunt Rose and the rest of this household next time.